Government and Politics of the USA explores the nature of U.S. democracy and the debate surrounding its effectiveness as a political system. This exam covers the principles of the U.S. Constitution, the structure and powers of key institutions of government, and how authority is exercised over citizens. It also examines ongoing debates about liberty, justice, and the quality of democracy in the USA, as well as the global impact of U.S. government and politics through comparison with the U.K. political system. The U.S. Constitution is the supreme written charter that establishes the structure, powers, and fundamental rights of the federal government of the United States. The nature of the U.S. Constitution is that it is codified as a single document, entrenched through a demanding amendment process and federal where authority is divided between national and state governments. The vagueness of the document means that its broad and general wording leaves significant scope for interpretation by institutions over time. The purpose of the Constitution being vague is to ensure that its principles remain adaptable so future generations can interpret it in ways that suit changing social and political conditions. An example of the U.S. Constitution being vague is shown by the 2022 Dobbs decision, where the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution contains no explicit reference to abortion, allowing conflicting interpretations of privacy and liberty. A codified constitution is a constitution written in a single authoritative document, and the U.S. Constitution demonstrates codification through its fixed text being cited directly in recent Supreme Court rulings such as Dobbs. An entrenched constitution is one that can only be altered through a rigorous amendment procedure, and the U.S. Constitution demonstrates entrenchment where calls to add a right to abortion have not succeeded because the demanding amendment thresholds have not been met. The branches of the U.S. government are the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. The legislative branch exercises lawmaking power and demonstrated this recently where Congress proposed amendments on issues such as congressional pay and presidential pardons. The executive branch exercises law enforcement power and demonstrated this where the President and federal agencies implemented and enforced immigration and regulatory policy. The judicial branch exercises interpretative power and demonstrated this where the Supreme Court interpreted constitutional provisions in Dobbs to determine that abortion is not a protected constitutional right. The amendment process of the U.S. Constitution operates through proposal by a two-thirds majority in Congress or a convention called by two-thirds of state legislatures, followed by ratification from three-quarters of the states. An example of the amendment process being used is shown by the continued proposal of amendments in Congress during recent years, even though none have been successfully ratified. The advantages of the formal amendment process of the U.S. Constitution lie in the stability it provides where constitutional change requires broad and lasting agreement across the nation. The disadvantages of the formal amendment process of the U.S. Constitution arise from its difficulty where necessary reforms can be blocked despite significant public support. The key features of the U.S. Constitution include federalism, separation of powers, checks and balances, bipartisanship, and limited government. Federalism divides authority between national and state governments, and the Constitution establishes this by granting defined national powers while reserving all remaining powers to the states. Federalism proves effective because it allows states to address local needs, shown by the diverse state-level responses to abortion and health care following the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Federalism proves ineffective because it creates clashes and inconsistency, highlighted by ongoing conflict between Texas and the federal government over immigration enforcement in recent years. Separation of powers divides governmental authority across three branches, and the Constitution enshrines this by allocating legislative power to Congress, executive power to the President, and judicial power to the courts. Separation of powers functions effectively because it prevents concentrated authority, demonstrated by the Supreme Court limiting executive regulatory influence when it overturned the Chevron deference doctrine in 2024. Separation of powers functions ineffectively when one branch expands its influence, shown by the Supreme Court's 2024 ruling granting broad presidential immunity that weakened judicial oversight. Checks and balances operate as a system where each branch limits the actions of the others to prevent dominance. The executive checks the legislature by using the veto power, which presidents have continued to exercise to block congressional bills in recent years. The executive checks the judiciary through the power to nominate judges, a power used repeatedly as presidents have continued to shape the Supreme Court and lower courts through new appointments. The legislature checks the executive through powers such as controlling funding, demonstrated by Congress limiting or delaying presidential spending priorities during budget negotiations. The legislature checks the judiciary by holding impeachment powers and by proposing amendments, a capability frequently discussed when controversial judicial rulings emerge. The judiciary checks the executive by striking down executive actions that exceed constitutional limits, as seen in rulings that curtailed federal agency powers after the 2024 rejection of the Chevron doctrine. The judiciary checks the legislature by overturning laws that violate the Constitution, a practice reaffirmed through recent judicial reviews challenging federal and state legislation. Checks and balances prove effective because they protect against unilateral action, illustrated by recent Supreme Court decisions restraining executive agencies. Checks and balances prove ineffective when branches enable one another's power, shown by judicial acceptance of expanded presidential immunity in 2024. Bipartisanship requires cooperation between political parties, and the Constitution fosters this through structures that require compromise between Congress and the President for legislation. Bipartisanship functions effectively when parties collaborate, demonstrated by cross-party support for recent budget agreements that prevented federal shutdowns. Bipartisanship functions ineffectively when polarization blocks compromise, evident in recent deadlock over immigration and social policy. Limited government restricts state power to defined constitutional grants, and the Constitution ensures this by listing federal powers and reserving all others to the states or the people. Limited government works effectively when courts prevent federal overreach, shown by judicial rulings in 2024 that curtailed expansive agency regulation. Limited government works ineffectively when constitutional limits are interpreted loosely, as seen in recent judicial decisions upholding broad executive discretion. The main characteristics of U.S. federalism lie in the constitutional division of power between national and state governments, the sharing of authority across policy areas, and the capacity of states to act independently in matters reserved to them. The division of power between national and state governments is shown by states adopting differing COVID-19 public health rules over the last 5 years, where state governors set their own lockdown and mask policies while the federal government issued nationwide guidance. The sharing of authority across policy areas is demonstrated by both levels of government taking action during the pandemic, where the federal government coordinated vaccine distribution while states controlled delivery and eligibility rules. The capacity of states to act independently is seen in contrasting state approaches to issues such as abortion access since 2022, where some states introduced strict bans while others expanded legal protections. The nature of the federal system of government rests on a blend of national supremacy in allocated areas and meaningful state autonomy across local matters, creating a structure that balances unity with regional variation. The nature of this system is illustrated by the differing state responses to climate policy over recent years, where states such as California advanced their own emission standards while the federal government pursued separate national targets. The U.S. federal government's relationship with the states involves federal authority taking precedence in areas granted by the Constitution while states retain significant control over domestic policy and administration. This relationship is shown by the 2023 Supreme Court decision in United States v. Texas, where the court confirmed that the federal government holds primary authority over immigration enforcement while states cannot compel changes to federal priorities. Interpretations and debates over the U.S. Constitution and Federalism center on how democratic its structures truly are, how far power should rest with the federal government or the states, and how constitutional principles shape the balance between popular control and institutional authority. The U.S. Constitution is democratic to a greater extent because it enshrines representative democracy and protection of individual rights, allowing citizens to vote for their leaders and hold government accountable. This is shown by the 2022 nationwide midterm elections in which record-high voter turnout in some states reflected widespread public engagement in selecting congressional and state officials. The U.S. Constitution is democratic to a lesser extent because some constitutional provisions and judicial interpretations limit popular control over certain aspects of government, placing power in less directly accountable institutions. This is shown by the 2024 ruling in Trump v. Anderson, where the United States Supreme Court held that only Congress may determine eligibility for federal office, restricting state-level democratic influence. The strengths of democracy in the U.S. Constitution are that it enables broad citizen participation through elections and safeguards individual rights through constitutional limits on government power. The weaknesses of democracy in the U.S. Constitution are that certain powers are insulated from direct popular control, and judicial or constitutional mechanisms can reduce responsiveness to public will. The impact of democracy in the U.S. Constitution on the U.S. government is that elected representatives must respond to voters' preferences while governance remains constrained by constitutional rules and judicial review. An example that shows this is the 2022 passage of state-level laws expanding or restricting voting access while courts and federal constitutional principles continue to shape what laws are permissible. The USA remains federal to a greater extent as states continue to have substantial autonomy over policy areas like labor, health, and social services rather than being governed solely by national law. This is shown in recent years by various states enacting labor protections or minimum wage laws above federal standards, exercising their authority independently of the federal government. The USA remains federal to a lesser extent as federal supreme judicial rulings and constitutional interpretation sometimes override or limit state authority on national issues. This is shown by the 2024 Supreme Court decision in Trump v. Anderson, which prevented individual states from determining eligibility for federal office, reaffirming federal supremacy in certain constitutional matters. Congress is the national legislature of the United States where elected representatives create, debate, and pass laws. The structure of Congress is a bicameral system with the House of Representatives and the Senate that follow staggered election cycles and differing membership sizes. A bicameral nature is a two-chamber legislative structure, which is present in the U.S. Congress as seen when the 2023 Fiscal Responsibility Act had to be approved separately by both the House and the Senate before becoming law. The membership structure of Congress by noting that the House is based on population while the Senate provides equal state representation with 2 senators per state. The powers of Congress are broad legislative, financial, and oversight responsibilities that shape federal governance. The powers that have been given to Congress by the Constitution are the authority to make laws, levy taxes, declare war, regulate commerce, and control federal spending. Exclusive powers are responsibilities assigned solely to one chamber of Congress without shared authority. The exclusive powers that have been given to the House of Representatives are initiating revenue bills and bringing forward articles of impeachment. The exclusive powers that have been given to the Senate are confirming presidential appointments, approving treaties, and conducting impeachment trials. Concurrent powers are responsibilities that both chambers of Congress share equally. The concurrent powers that have been given to Congress are passing legislation, overriding presidential vetoes, and amending the Constitution. The functions of Congress are representation, legislation, and oversight that collectively shape federal direction. Representation is the process where elected members act on behalf of their constituents' interests at the national level. Congressional elections are regular contests for seats in both chambers and affects the function of representation as shifting party control can alter whose interests dominate, shown when the 2022 midterms delivered a Republican House that changed legislative priorities. Incumbency is the electoral advantage enjoyed by current office holders and is significant as name recognition, fundraising strength, and constituent services boost re-election prospects, which affects the function of representation as it can entrench long-standing voices, shown when Senator Raphael Warnock won re-election in 2022 with strong incumbent advantages. The factors that affect voting behavior within Congress are parties and caucuses, constituency, pressure groups, and lobbyists. Parties and caucuses are organized groups that coordinate policy positions and voting patterns and affect the function of representation by encouraging unity, shown when Democrats in 2021 largely voted together to pass the American Rescue Plan. Constituency is the geographic population a member represents and affects the function of representation by shaping voting behavior to align with local priorities, shown when Midwestern legislators pushed for agricultural subsidies in the 2023 Farm Bill negotiations. Pressure groups and lobbyists are organized interests that attempt to influence legislative decisions and affect the function of representation by amplifying certain policy demands, shown when environmental groups lobbied members to support climate provisions in the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. Legislation is the creation, amendment, and repeal of federal laws through formal congressional procedures. The legislative process in the U.S. is a multi-stage system where bills pass through committees, floor debates, and votes in both chambers before presidential approval. The strengths of the U.S. legislative process are scrutiny, compromise, and broad debate that help ensure careful lawmaking, shown when bipartisan cooperation produced the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. However, the weaknesses of the U.S. legislative process are gridlock, slow negotiation, and partisan obstruction that hinder effective action, shown when repeated disputes in 2023 brought the federal government close to a shutdown. The differences between the legislative process in each chamber are the House's majoritarian rules and the Senate's extended debate procedures that shape lawmaking differently, shown when the Senate filibuster delayed immigration reform efforts in 2021 while the House passed its version swiftly. The policy significance of Congress is its ability to set national priorities, allocate funding, and shape social and economic outcomes. Explain the impact and effectiveness of the laws passed by Congress by noting that major statutes can reshape national policy, shown when the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022 boosted domestic semiconductor investment. Oversight is the monitoring and investigation of the executive branch to ensure accountability and lawful conduct. The factors that influence the relationship between Congress and the presidency are party control, national events, and political incentives, shown when divided government in 2023 led to clashes over the debt ceiling. The checks that Congress has over the presidency are powers such as impeachment, veto overrides, and control of federal spending, shown when Congress limited presidential emergency spending plans during the 2021 budget cycle. The checks that Congress has over the judiciary are confirmation of judges, altering court jurisdiction, and proposing constitutional amendments, shown when the Senate confirmed Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson in 2022. Congress is effective to a greater extent as it passes significant bipartisan legislation and fulfills its oversight role, shown when Congress strengthened veteran health care through the 2022 PACT Act. However, Congress is effective to a lesser extent as partisan division obstructs timely lawmaking and reduces policy coherence, shown when repeated speaker elections in 2023 stalled legislative progress. The interpretations and debates around Congress center on how effectively it fulfills its roles, exercises its powers, and represents the diverse interests of the nation. The roles of Congress have changed over the last 10 years as it has taken a more proactive stance on economic security and industry regulation, which is important as it strengthens national resilience and legislative influence over long-term policy direction, and is shown in the 2022 CHIPS and Science Act that expanded federal support for domestic semiconductor production. The powers of Congress have changed over the last 10 years as it has asserted greater control over federal spending and executive decision-making, which is important as it shapes national fiscal stability and limits unilateral executive action, and is shown in the 2023 Fiscal Responsibility Act that introduced new borrowing caps and spending controls. Congress's representative role is adequate as members have increasingly championed constituent interests on major issues, shown when lawmakers from disaster-affected states secured substantial federal relief funding after the 2023 wildfires in Hawaii. Congress's representative role is not adequate as polarization can distance members from wider national interests, shown when partisan conflict in 2023 delayed progress on immigration reform despite broad public concern. Parties in Congress are significant as they coordinate voting, messaging, and legislative priorities, shown when unified Democratic support enabled the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022. However, parties in Congress may not be significant as cross-party coalitions can still shape impactful outcomes, shown when bipartisan groups negotiated the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. The powers outlined in the U.S. Constitution are significant and effective as they allow Congress to check the executive and uphold accountability, shown when Congress mandated greater oversight of defense spending in the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act. However, they are not significant and effective as partisan obstruction and institutional limits can prevent Congress from fully exercising its authority, shown when repeated filibusters in 2021 and 2022 blocked voting rights reform. The U.S. presidency is the chief executive institution of the federal government where a single elected leader exercises constitutional, political, and administrative authority to shape national policy at home and abroad. The formal sources of power of the U.S. President, as outlined in the U.S. Constitution, are the powers to act as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, to grant pardons and reprieves, to make treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate, to nominate and appoint ambassadors, judges, and other officers with Senate approval, and to sign or veto legislation passed by Congress. The power of Commander-in-Chief means the President leads the U.S. military and, for example, authorized continued support and defense aid to Ukraine during the conflict with Russia in recent years. The power to grant pardons and reprieves, which allows the president to forgive federal offenses, was used when President Trump issued pardons to individuals involved in the attack on the U.S. Capitol in 2025. The power to make treaties, requiring two-thirds Senate approval, allows the president to negotiate international agreements such as the AUKUS Security Pact with the UK and Australia. The power to nominate and appoint officials, where the Senate confirms, was seen when President Biden appointed Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court in 2022. The power to sign or veto legislation means the president can approve or reject bills passed by Congress, as shown when President Biden vetoed the Judges Act in late 2024. The president has the role of the head of state, which means that the president symbolically represents the nation to both the American people and other countries and performs ceremonial and unifying functions. An example of the president fulfilling this role is Joe Biden's 2023 visit to Kiev to show solidarity with Ukraine during the war with Russia, emphasizing unity and support. The president also has the role of the head of government, which means that the president directs the executive branch, implements and enforces laws, and sets national policy priorities. An example of the president fulfilling this role is when President Biden imposed sanctions on Russia and authorized substantial military and economic aid to Ukraine, guiding national policy. These powers have been significant as they allow the president to shape domestic and foreign policy and respond to national and international crises without sole reliance on Congress. An example of this is the widespread use of executive orders by President Trump in 2025 to direct federal action on issues such as AI regulation and immigration, reflecting major policy initiatives. However, these powers may not have been significant as they can be limited or checked by Congress, the courts, and political constraints, reducing unilateral action. An example of this is when courts blocked or challenged executive orders from recent administrations, demonstrating judicial checks on presidential authority. The informal sources of presidential power are the electoral mandate from their election victory, the ability to issue executive orders, influence gained through national events and crises, and authority drawn from their cabinet of advisors. The electoral mandate gives a president perceived legitimacy to pursue their agenda, as seen when President Biden cited his 2020 election victory to push through infrastructure and social spending early in his term. Executive orders allow a president to direct government action without Congress, as shown by President Trump's 2025 executive order aimed at blocking state AI regulations. National events can strengthen a president's power when they lead public opinion or shift priorities, as when President Biden responded to the COVID-19 pandemic with nationwide vaccination campaigns and policy measures. The cabinet, composed of department heads and senior officials, advises the president and helps coordinate policy, as seen when President Biden's cabinet officials worked together on the federal response during Hurricane Ida in 2021. The president also has powers of persuasion, which are the ability to use speeches, media engagement, and negotiation to influence Congress, public opinion, and state leaders to support their policies. For Joe Biden, this meant regularly addressing the nation and Congress to build support for his Build Back Better and infrastructure plans. For Donald Trump, it involved rally speeches and direct communication to pressure legislators on border and economic policies. For Barack Obama, it was evident in his televised appeals for the Affordable Care Act. For Donald Trump in his first term, it included social media and rally-driven pressure on tax and trade reforms. For George W. Bush, it was clear in his postal 9/11 addresses that united public support for security legislation. The president also has access to the executive office of the president, which has the roles of providing expert advice and administrative support for policy making and implementation across government, coordinating national security and foreign policy through the National Security Council, overseeing the federal budget and regulatory review via the Office of Management and Budget, and managing the president's immediate staff and communications through the White House office. The executive office of the president serves as the president's central hub for policy development and coordination across the executive branch, helping to draft and analyze proposals and communicate priorities to agencies and Congress, as seen in the role it played in shaping key federal initiatives in recent years. The National Security Council advises and assists the president on national security and foreign policy and coordinates these matters across government, exemplified by the restructuring and staffing changes in 2025 that aligned it with the current administration's strategic priorities. The Office of Management and Budget oversees the preparation and execution of the federal budget and reviews regulatory and legislative proposals to ensure they align with the President's objectives, as shown by its issuance of guidance in December 2025 directing federal agencies on unbiased artificial intelligence procurement. The White House office manages the President's daily operations, staff, and messaging, including digital strategy and communications efforts that support policy priorities and public engagement. These powers have been significant as they allow presidents to shape policy and respond to urgent issues more effectively than through formal powers alone. An example of this is how President Biden's use of executive orders and persuasion helped advance COVID-19 vaccination efforts and economic support legislation in the face of divided government. However, these powers may not have been significant as they can be constrained by opposition from Congress, courts, and shifts in public opinion that limit a president's ability to act unilaterally. An example of this is when the U.S. House of Representatives voted to overturn one of President Trump's executive orders in 2025, demonstrating legislative pushback on presidential initiatives. There are many factors that affect the presidency and many limitations on presidential power. The relationship between the presidency and Congress is shaped by a constitutional balance of powers where the president proposes and advocates policy but must work with Congress to pass laws, fund government operations, and make appointments. This relationship varies as it depends on whether the president's party controls one or both chambers of Congress and on the political climate, which affects cooperation or conflict on legislation. An example of this varying relationship is the 2025 United States federal government shutdown when Republican and Democratic lawmakers failed to agree on funding measures for over 40 days before passing a bill that the president signed, highlighting deep partisan stalemate with Congress. The relationship between the presidency and the Supreme Court is dynamic and defined by judicial review and constitutional interpretation, where the court can uphold or limit presidential actions while presidents influence the court's composition through appointments. This relationship varies as the court may support or constrain presidential policies depending on legal arguments and the justices' interpretations of the Constitution. An example of this varying relationship is the 2024 Trump versus United States Supreme Court ruling that granted substantial immunity to a president for core official acts but clarified limits on immunity for unofficial acts, shaping the scope of presidential authority. The limitations on presidential power are the changing nature of power over the president's term in office, the role of Congress in legislation and oversight, the Supreme Court's judicial review, the constraints of the Constitution itself, the election cycle with midterm and general elections, and divided government where control of Congress and the presidency differ. The changing nature of power over a president's term varies because as a term progresses and the political environment changes, a president's influence can grow or diminish, as seen when presidents lose seats at midterm elections leading to weaker legislative leverage. Congress limits presidential power through its lawmaking authority, oversight, and control of budgets, as seen in 2025 when congressional deadlock over funding led to a prolonged government shutdown that constrained executive action. The Supreme Court limits presidential power by striking down or upholding executive actions based on constitutional grounds, as illustrated by the Trump versus United States decision influencing the legal boundaries of presidential immunity and accountability. The Constitution itself limits presidential power by dividing authority among branches and outlining specific roles and checks, as evident in the separation of powers that prevents any branch from encroaching on others. The election cycle limits presidential power because midterm and general elections can change the composition of Congress and public support, affecting policy agendas and legislative success, as seen in multiple shifts in control following midterms in recent decades. Divided government limits presidential power because opposing party control of one or both chambers of Congress can stymie legislative priorities, as seen during Barack Obama's second term when Republican control of the House slowed his legislative agenda. These limitations have been significant as they have enforced checks and balances that prevent unchecked executive authority and require negotiation and compromise across branches. An example of this is the repeated federal government shutdowns triggered by clashes between the President and Congress over budget priorities, demonstrating how institutional checks can halt or delay executive initiatives. These limitations may not have been significant as at times presidents have used executive orders or benefited from a Supreme Court sympathetic to their view, enabling substantial policy changes without sweeping legislative approval. An example of this is the Supreme Court allowing a president to remove independent federal agency commissioners in 2025, affirming executive authority over agency appointments and weakening constraints on presidential control of regulatory bodies. Interpretations and debates over the U.S. presidency center on how effectively presidents achieve their aims, the extent to which their power expands or is constrained, and the balance between their roles in domestic governance and foreign policy. The president has effectively achieved their aims as they have passed major legislation and shaped significant policy outcomes domestically and internationally, such as boosting infrastructure and climate action. An example that proves this is President Biden signing the Inflation Reduction Act and Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which together represent substantial investment in climate action and infrastructure across the United States. However, the president may not have achieved aims as public perception and political realities have sometimes undermined or slowed the implementation or acceptance of key policy goals. An example that proves this is how President Biden's efforts on immigration and inflation struggle to gain public approval despite legislative successes, contributing to political backlash in recent years. An imperial presidency is one where the executive branch expands its authority beyond constitutional limits, whereas an imperiled presidency is one where executive power is weakened by strong checks from other branches or political constraints. The presidency is more imperial as some recent administrations have sought to expand executive action through broad use of executive orders and expansive interpretations of presidential authority in foreign and domestic policy. An example that proves this is concerns raised about President Trump's use of unilateral executive actions in his second term that critics argued risked overstepping constitutional checks and concentrating power. However, the presidency may be more imperiled as intense scrutiny, legal challenges and political opposition have constrained executive ambitions and highlighted limits on unilateral presidential power. An example that proves this is the House of Representatives shelving an effort to impeach President Trump over unauthorized military strikes on Iran, demonstrating how political dynamics can protect or restrict executive accountability. The president has been held accountable by Congress to a greater extent as impeachment inquiries and investigations have forced public examination of presidential conduct and limits on executive action. An example that proves this is the 2019 impeachment and subsequent acquittal of President Trump over allegations of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress, underscoring congressional oversight. However, the president may have been held accountable by Congress to a lesser extent as political alignment between the executive and legislative majority can limit effective oversight and consequences. An example that proves this is when Republican and Democratic leaders voted overwhelmingly to dismiss an impeachment resolution against President Trump in 2025 over military actions, showing partisan dynamics can blunt congressional accountability. The president has a significant role over foreign policy as they direct diplomatic relations, military strategy, and alliances with other nations. An example that proves this is President Biden's leadership in rallying NATO allies and expanding security partnerships to support Ukraine against Russian aggression. However, the president may not have a significant role over foreign policy as congressional and international constraints can limit unilateral decision-making in global affairs. An example that proves this is how debates in Congress and public opinion have shaped and sometimes restricted executive decisions on foreign military engagements in recent years. The U.S. civil court system resolves non-criminal disputes between individuals or the state, while civil rights are the fundamental freedoms and protections guaranteed by the Constitution and laws to ensure equal treatment and liberty under the law. The role of the U.S. Supreme Court as set out in the Constitution is to interpret the Constitution, act as the final court of appeal, and ensure that laws and government actions comply with constitutional principles. The nature of the U.S. Supreme Court is independent, where justices are protected from political influence through life tenure and secure salaries, allowing impartial decision-making. What is the judicial review process of the Supreme Court is the authority to assess laws and executive actions and declare them unconstitutional where they conflict with the Constitution. The case of Marbury v. Madison 1803 shaped judicial review by establishing the Supreme Court's power to declare acts of Congress unconstitutional. The case of Fletcher v. Peck 1810 shaped judicial review by extending this power to state laws, confirming that state legislation could also be reviewed and struck down if unconstitutional. The appointment process for the Supreme Court is where the President nominates a justice, the Senate Judiciary Committee holds hearings, and the full Senate confirms the nominee by a majority vote. The strengths of the appointment process are that it involves both the executive and legislative branches, promoting checks and balances and democratic accountability. However, the weaknesses of the appointment process are that it can become highly politicized, leading to partisan conflict and delays in filling vacancies. The factors that influence the president's choice of nominee are political ideology, likelihood of Senate approval, judicial experience, age, and the desire to shape the court's long-term direction. The current composition of the U.S. Supreme Court is 9 justices appointed for life, including 1 Chief Justice and 8 Associate Justices. The current ideological balance of the U.S. Supreme Court is a conservative majority, reflecting the greater number of justices appointed by Republican presidents. The impact of the U.S. Supreme Court on public policy is that its rulings can fundamentally change the direction of government policy by upholding or striking down laws and executive actions. An example of this is Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization 2022, where the court overturned Roe v. Wade and allowed individual states to set their own abortion laws. Another example of this is Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard 2023, where the court ruled that race-based affirmative action in university admissions was unconstitutional. The political significance debate is the argument over whether the Supreme Court acts as a neutral interpreter of the Constitution or as a political actor shaping policy outcomes. Judicial activism is where the Supreme Court takes an active role in interpreting the Constitution in a way that leads to significant changes in law or public policy. The criticisms of judicial activism are that it undermines democratic accountability and allows unelected judges to impose their own values rather than reflecting the will of the electorate. An example of the Supreme Court demonstrating judicial activism is Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization 2022, where the court overturned long-standing precedent and reshaped abortion policy across the U.S. Judicial restraint is where the Supreme Court limits its role by deferring to elected branches of government and avoiding broad or far-reaching constitutional interpretations. The criticisms of judicial restraint are that it can allow unconstitutional laws to remain in force and fail to protect minority rights. An example of the Supreme Court demonstrating judicial restraint is Moore v. Harper 2023, where the court rejected the independent state legislature theory and avoided radically altering the balance of power in federal elections. Civil rights and liberties can be protected by the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, constitutional amendments, and rulings of the Supreme Court. The rights and liberties that are protected by the Constitution are fundamental principles such as separation of powers, federalism, due process, and protection from arbitrary government action. An example of the Constitution protecting these rights is Trump v. United States 2024, where the Supreme Court clarified the limits of presidential immunity to uphold constitutional checks and balances. The rights and liberties that are protected by the Bill of Rights are freedoms including speech, religion, assembly, a fair trial, and protection from unreasonable searches and punishments. An example of the Bill of Rights protecting these rights is New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin 2022, where the Supreme Court strengthened Second Amendment protections on carrying firearms. The rights and liberties that are protected by constitutional amendments are equality before the law, voting rights, and protection against discrimination based on race, sex, or age. An example of the constitutional amendments protecting these rights is Allen v. Milligan 2023, where the Supreme Court upheld the Voting Rights Act to protect minority voting rights under the 15th Amendment. The rights and liberties that are protected by the rulings of the Supreme Court are those interpreted and expanded through case law, including privacy, equality, and procedural fairness. An example of the rulings of the Supreme Court protecting these rights is Department of Homeland Security v. Regents of the University of California 2020, where the court protected the rights of DACA recipients by requiring lawful decision-making by the executive branch. The methods used by racial rights campaigns are protests, legal challenges, lobbying, media activism, and grassroots organizing aimed at highlighting racial inequality and pressuring policymakers. An example of this is the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 to 2021, where mass demonstrations were used to demand police reform and racial justice following the death of George Floyd. The influence of racial rights campaigns is that they shape public opinion and place sustained pressure on governments to address racial inequality through policy change. An example of this is the introduction of the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act in 2021, which was influenced by racial justice campaigning even though it did not ultimately pass. Racial rights campaigns are effective to a greater extent as they can achieve concrete legal and political outcomes by mobilizing public support and influencing institutions. An example that proves this is the Supreme Court decision in Allen v. Milligan 2023, where racial rights advocacy helped protect minority voting rights under the Voting Rights Act. However, racial rights campaigns may be effective to a lesser extent as strong political opposition and institutional barriers can limit long-term policy success. An example that proves this is the failure of the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act after 2021, despite widespread campaigning and public support. The impact of racial rights campaigns on domestic policy regarding voting rights is that they have sought to challenge voter suppression laws and protect minority electoral participation. The impact of racial rights campaigns on domestic policy regarding affirmative action is that they have defended race-conscious policies, although recent court rulings have limited their success. The impact of racial rights campaigns on domestic policy regarding representation is that they have increased awareness and pressure for greater racial diversity in political and judicial institutions. An example that shows the impact of racial rights campaign on domestic policy is the confirmation of Ketanji Brown Jackson to the U.S. Supreme Court in 2022, reflecting sustained advocacy for greater racial representation. The interpretations and debates of the U.S. Supreme Court and Civil Rights center on whether the court acts primarily as a neutral judicial body or a political institution, and how its constitutional interpretations either expand or restrict civil and constitutional rights in modern society. There are arguments that the U.S. Supreme Court is more political than judicial. The arguments that the Supreme Court is more political are that justices are appointed through a partisan process and often decide cases along ideological lines on highly controversial issues. An example that shows this is Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization 2022, where the conservative majority overturned Roe v. Wade in a way that reflected ideological divisions. However, that arguments that the Supreme Court is more judicial are that it bases decisions on constitutional interpretation and legal precedent rather than party loyalty. An example that shows this is Moore v. Harper 2023, where conservative justices rejected the independent state legislature theory despite political pressure. The idea of the living Constitution is that the Constitution should be interpreted flexibly so that its meaning can adapt to modern values and changing social conditions. The idea of originalism is that the Constitution should be interpreted according to the original meaning intended by the framers at the time it was written. The arguments that the living Constitution goes against originalism are that it allows judges to reinterpret constitutional principles beyond their original meaning, increasing judicial discretion. An example that shows this is Obergefell v. Hodges remaining influential in later rulings over the last 5 years despite criticism from originalist justices. The arguments that the living Constitution does not go against originalism are that broad constitutional principles were intentionally framed to allow flexibility over time. An example that shows this is Bostock v. Clayton County 2020, where the court interpreted the Civil Rights Act consistently with constitutional principles while applying them to modern contexts. Civil and constitutional rights have been upheld by the Supreme Court to a greater extent as the court has enforced limits on executive and legislative power. An example that shows this is Department of Homeland Security v. Regents of the University of California 2020, where the court protected the rights of DACA recipients. However, civil and constitutional rights may have been upheld by the Supreme Court to a lesser extent as some rulings have reduced previously recognized protections. An example that shows this is Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization 2022, where abortion rights were removed from constitutional protection. The Supreme Court protects civil and constitutional rights to a greater extent as it can strike down laws that violate constitutional guarantees. An example that shows this is Allen v. Milligan 2023, where the court protected minority voting rights under the Voting Rights Act. However, the Supreme Court protects civil and constitutional rights to a lesser extent as it sometimes defers to state authority even where rights are limited. An example that shows this is Brnovic v. Democratic National Committee 2021, where restrictions on voting laws were upheld. The U.S. Supreme Court has powers over civil rights to a greater extent as it has judicial review and the final authority on constitutional interpretation. An example that shows this is Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard 2023, where the court reshaped national policy on affirmative action. However, the U.S. Supreme Court has powers over civil rights to a lesser extent as it relies on other branches to enforce its rulings. An example that shows this is ongoing state-level resistance to federal voting rights protections after 2021. The Supreme Court has effective checks and balances as it can limit the actions of Congress and the President through judicial review. An example that shows this is Trump v. United States 2024, where the court clarified constitutional limits on presidential immunity. However, the checks and balances may not be effective as justices are unelected and hold office for life with limited accountability. An example that shows this is public criticism of the court following Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization 2022. The measures that the Supreme Court has taken to promote equality include affirmative action and immigration reform. The successes of the Supreme Court's measures of affirmative action are that they supported diversity in education for many years, as seen in Fisher v. University of Texas 2016. However, the failures of these measures are that they were significantly weakened in Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard 2023, limiting their future use. The successes of the Supreme Court's measures of immigration reform are that it protected immigrant rights by requiring lawful executive decision-making, as seen in Department of Homeland Security v. Regents of the University of California 2020. However, the failures of these measures are that the court has allowed stricter immigration enforcement to continue, as shown in Biden v. Texas 2022. Democracy and participation in the USA refer to the way citizens engage in politics through elections, representation, and pressure groups to influence government decision-making and policy outcomes. The electoral system in the USA is a federal, indirect system based on single-member districts and the Electoral College where voters do not directly choose the president. The main process to elect a U.S. president is a long cycle involving party primaries and caucuses, national party conventions, a nationwide general election, and a final decision by the Electoral College. The constitutional requirements when electing a U.S. president are that the candidate must be at least 35 years old, be a natural-born citizen, and have lived in the USA for at least 14 years. The invisible primary is the informal stage before voting begins where candidates seek media attention, elite endorsements, and fundraising support, and affects the election as it narrows the field before primaries start. This is shown when Joe Biden secured strong party endorsements and fundraising support in 2019, which helped establish him as the Democratic frontrunner before voting began. Primaries and caucuses are state-level elections where party members choose delegates to support a candidate and affect the election as they determine the eventual party nominee. This is shown when Donald Trump won a majority of Republican primaries in 2016, allowing him to secure the nomination despite early party opposition. The role of national party conventions when electing a president is to formally nominate the party's candidate, unite the party, and launch the general election campaign. This is shown when the Democratic National Convention in 2020 officially nominated Joe Biden and helped consolidate party support ahead of the general election. The role of the Electoral College is when electing a president is to translate state-level election results into electoral votes that formally decide the presidency. This is shown when Joe Biden won the presidency in 2020 after securing 306 electoral votes despite close margins in several key swing states. The resulting party system after the election is a two-party system dominated by the Democrats and Republicans. This is shown when the 2024 presidential election again featured only Democratic and Republican candidates as realistic contenders for the presidency. Incumbency is the advantage held by a sitting president who is already in office during an election. Incumbency is important for a president seeking a second term as it provides greater media exposure, name recognition, and the ability to use the powers of office. This is shown when Donald Trump used presidential press coverage and executive authority extensively during the 2020 election campaign. However, incumbency may not be important for a president seeking a second term as poor economic performance or major crises can outweigh its advantages. This is shown when Donald Trump lost the 2020 election following public dissatisfaction with his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. The role of campaign finance in an election is to fund advertising, staffing, travel, and voter mobilization efforts that increase a candidate's visibility and competitiveness. This is shown when Joe Biden and Donald Trump both raised hundreds of millions of dollars in the 2020 election, allowing them to dominate media coverage. The current legislation on campaign finance is a mix of federal limits on direct donations and regulations overseen by the Federal Election Commission. The McCain-Feingold reforms from 2002 mean that soft money donations to national parties are banned and limits are placed on broadcast election advertising. The case of Citizens United vs FEC 2010 mean that corporations and unions can spend unlimited amounts on independent political advertising, increasing the influence of super PACs. The key ideas and principles of the Democratic and Republican parties can be understood by examining how power is distributed between them, their contrasting ideological positions, internal divisions, and the social factors that shape voter support. The distribution of power among the Democrats and Republicans is relatively balanced at a national level, with control frequently shifting between the two parties across the presidency, Congress, and state governments. In relation to the U.S. Democrat Party, a progressive attitude on social and moral issues, including crime, is shown through policies such as criminal justice reform, as seen when Democratic-led states like New York raised the age of criminal responsibility and supported bail reform between 2019 and 2023. In relation to the U.S. Democrat Party, greater governmental intervention in the national economy is demonstrated by large-scale federal spending, as shown when the Biden administration passed the American Rescue Plan in 2021 to stimulate economic recovery after COVID-19. In relation to the U.S. Democrat Party, government provision of social welfare is a core belief, as shown when Democrats expanded access to health care subsidies under the Affordable Care Act through legislation passed in 2021. In relation to the U.S. Republican Party, a conservative attitude on social and moral issues is evident, as shown when Republican-led states such as Texas passed restrictive abortion laws following the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs v. Jackson in 2022. In relation to the U.S. Republican Party, more restricted governmental intervention in the national economy while protecting American trade and jobs is shown when Republican leaders supported tariffs and trade protection measures originally introduced under Donald Trump and defended them during the 2024 campaign. In relation to the U.S. Republican Party, acceptance of social welfare but a preference for personal responsibility is shown when Republicans backed work requirements for welfare benefits, as proposed by House Republicans in budget plans between 2023 and 2024. The U.S. Democrats have three factions: liberals, moderates, and conservatives. The U.S. Democrats liberals are members of the party who support progressive policies such as expanded social welfare, strong civil rights protections, and greater government involvement in the economy. The U.S. Democrats moderates are members of the party who favor centrist policies, pragmatic compromise, and incremental reform rather than radical change. The U.S. Democrats conservatives are members of the party who hold more traditional or cautious views on economic policy and government spending while remaining socially liberal. The U.S. Republicans also have three factions: moderates, social conservatives, and fiscal conservatives. The U.S. Republican moderates are members of the party who support limited government and free markets while being more flexible on social issues. The U.S. Republican social conservatives are members of the party who prioritize traditional moral values, religious influence in politics, and opposition to abortion and same-sex marriage. The U.S. Republican fiscal conservatives are members of the party who focus on reducing government spending, cutting taxes, and limiting state intervention in the economy. The current conflicts and tendencies within the Democratic Party involve growing influence from liberals challenging moderates over issues such as healthcare and climate policy, leading to internal tensions over the party's future direction. The current conflicts and tendencies within the Republican Party involve increasing dominance of social conservatives and populist figures, which has reduced the influence of moderates and intensified ideological divisions within the party. In relation to race, voting patterns were influenced in the 2020 presidential election campaign as ethnic minority voters overwhelmingly supported Joe Biden due to Democratic positions on civil rights and social justice. In relation to religion, voting patterns in the 2020 presidential election campaign were influenced as white evangelical Christians strongly supported Donald Trump due to his conservative stance on abortion and religious freedom. In relation to gender, voting patterns in the 2020 presidential election campaign were influenced by a significant gender gap where women were more likely to vote for Joe Biden due to concerns over healthcare and social issues. In relation to education, voting patterns in the 2020 presidential election campaign were influenced as university-educated voters tended to support Joe Biden while non-university-educated voters were more likely to support Donald Trump due to differing economic and cultural priorities. An interest group is an organized body that seeks to influence public policy and government decisions without standing candidates for election. Interest groups are significant in the USA as they provide representation for specific interests and attempt to shape legislation and public opinion. This is shown when gun control groups such as Everytown for Gun Safety increased lobbying and campaigning following major mass shootings between 2021 and 2023. However, interest groups may not be significant in the USA as elected officials and courts may ignore their demands or act independently. This is shown when Congress failed to pass comprehensive gun control legislation despite sustained pressure from multiple interest groups after the 2022 Uvalde shooting. The resources that interest groups in the USA have are money, expertise, membership numbers, access to policymakers, and media influence. The tactics that interest groups in the USA use are lobbying, litigation, campaign donations, grassroots mobilization, and public awareness campaigns. Interest groups do have an impact on democracy in the USA as they increase participation and ensure diverse views are represented in the political process. This is shown when civil rights groups supported voter registration drives during the 2020 and 2024 election cycles to increase turnout among underrepresented groups. However, interest groups may not have an impact on democracy in the USA as wealthy groups can dominate decision-making and marginalize ordinary voters. This is shown when corporate-backed super PACs spent heavily during the 2020 presidential election, raising concerns about unequal political influence. A professional interest group is an organization that represents the interests of people working in a specific profession. An example of a professional interest groups in the USA is the American Medical Association. The influence of the American Medical Association is seen through its ability to shape healthcare debates by advising lawmakers on medical policy. The methods of the American Medical Association include lobbying Congress, publishing expert research, and engaging with government agencies. The power of the American Medical Association comes from its professional expertise, credibility, and access to policymakers. A policy interest group is an organization that seeks to promote a particular cause or set of values rather than the interests of its members. An example of a policy interest groups in the USA is the American Civil Liberties Union. The influence of the American Civil Liberties Union is shown through its role in shaping civil rights policy and public debate. The methods of the American Civil Liberties Union include strategic litigation, lobbying, and public education campaigns. The power of the American Civil Liberties Union comes from its legal expertise, high-profile court cases, and strong public support. The interpretations and debates of U.S. democracy and participation focus on the strengths and weaknesses of elections, the Electoral College, campaign finance, incumbency, and the influence of interest groups on political engagement and representation. The advantages of the U.S. electoral process are that it encourages high political participation, regular elections, and clear choices between candidates and parties. This is shown when voter turnout increased significantly in the 2020 presidential election, reflecting strong public engagement despite the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the disadvantages of the U.S. electoral process are that it can discourage participation through voter suppression, complex registration rules, and unequal representation. This is shown when several states introduced stricter voter ID laws after 2020, which critics argued reduced access for minority and low-income voters. The advantages of the Electoral College are that it protects the interests of smaller states and reinforces the federal nature of the political system. This is shown when smaller swing states such as Arizona and Georgia received significant campaign attention during the 2020 election. However, the disadvantages of the Electoral College are that it can distort the popular will and allow a candidate to focus only on a few key states. This is shown when millions of votes in safe states such as California and Alabama had little impact on the final outcome in 2020. The electoral system and Electoral College should be reformed as they can produce unrepresentative outcomes and undermine public confidence in democracy. An example that backs this is widespread public debate and protest following the 2020 election over whether the Electoral College fairly reflected the popular vote. However, it should not be reformed as it provides stability and prevents densely populated areas from dominating national politics. An example that backs this is the peaceful transfer of power following the Electoral College certification of Joe Biden's victory in January 2021. The role of campaign finance is effective as it allows candidates to communicate their policies widely and mobilize voters. An example that backs this is the extensive use of digital advertising funded by large donations during the 2020 presidential campaign. However, the role of campaign finance is not effective as it gives wealthy donors and groups disproportionate influence over elections. An example that backs this is the dominance of super PAC spending during the 2020 election, which overshadowed smaller grassroots campaigns. Campaign finance has been effectively reformed as transparency requirements mean that many donations must be publicly disclosed. An example that backs this is the routine reporting of campaign donations to the Federal Election Commission during the 2024 election cycle. However, campaign finance may not have been effectively reformed as loopholes still allow unlimited independent spending. An example that backs this is the continued growth of super PAC expenditure in federal elections since 2020. Incumbency has an important role in elections as sitting officeholders benefit from name recognition, media coverage, and access to resources. An example that backs this is President Biden's ability to use presidential visibility and achievements during the 2024 campaign. However, incumbency may not have an important role in elections as public dissatisfaction can outweigh its advantages. An example that backs this is Donald Trump's defeat in the 2020 election despite holding the presidency. Interest groups can influence the three branches of government as they lobby legislators, challenge laws through the courts, and advise the executive. An example that backs this is the American Civil Liberties Union bringing legal challenges to state voting laws between 2021 and 2023. However, they cannot influence the branches of government as officials may prioritize public opinion, party loyalty, or constitutional limits. An example that backs this is the Supreme Court allowing restrictive abortion laws to stand in several states despite sustained interest group opposition since 2022. Interest groups can influence policy creation as they provide expertise, draft proposals, and apply pressure during the legislative process. An example that backs this is environmental groups influencing elements of climate policy within the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022. However, interest groups may not be able to influence policy creation as strong partisan divisions can block reform. An example that backs this is the repeated failure of Congress to pass comprehensive gun control legislation despite intense lobbying since 2020. A comparative approach is a method of analyzing political systems by comparing different countries to identify similarities and differences in how they operate. The different comparative approaches are rational, cultural, and structural, each offering a distinct way of understanding political behavior and outcomes. The rational approach is a method of comparison that explains politics by focusing on the decisions and actions of individual political actors. The rational approach by stating that it focuses on individuals within a political system and assumes they act logically to maximize personal benefit and achieve favorable outcomes. Using the rational approach, a similarity between the UK and US government and political system is that politicians in both systems act strategically to gain votes, power, and influence. Using the rational approach, a difference between the UK and US government and political system is that UK politicians often prioritize party unity while US politicians may prioritize individual electoral success. The cultural approach is a method of comparison that explains politics through shared beliefs, values, and traditions within society. Explain the cultural approach by stating that it focuses on groups such as voters, political parties, and pressure groups and argues that shared ideas and values shape individual political behavior. Using the cultural approach, a similarity between the UK and US government and political system is that both countries value democracy, individual rights, and political participation. Using the cultural approach, a difference between the UK and US government and political system is that US political culture places greater emphasis on constitutionalism and individual liberty than the UK. The structural approach is a method of comparison that analyses political systems by examining their institutions and formal processes. Explain the structural approach by stating that it focuses on political institutions and processes and suggests that outcomes are largely determined by formal rules and procedures. Using the structural approach, a similarity between the UK and US government and political system is that both have established legislatures that scrutinize and pass laws. Using the structural approach, a difference between the UK and US government and political system is that the UK has a parliamentary system while the US operates a presidential system with a strict separation of powers. There are many similarities and differences between the UK and US governments and political systems, regarding the constitutions, the branches of government and democracy. In terms of their nature, the UK Constitution is uncodified and flexible while the US Constitution is codified and entrenched, leading to greater adaptability in UK politics but stronger legal certainty and rigidity in US government. In terms of their sources, the UK Constitution draws from statutes, common law, conventions, and authoritative works, whereas the US Constitution is primarily derived from a single written document, resulting in a broader range of influences in UK governance compared to the legal dominance of the US Supreme Court. In terms of their provisions, the US Constitution clearly sets out separation of powers with formal checks and balances, while the UK Constitution relies on parliamentary sovereignty and a fusion of powers, creating stronger institutional constraints in the US and greater executive dominance in the UK. In terms of their principles, both constitutions uphold democracy and the rule of law, but the US places greater emphasis on constitutional supremacy while the UK prioritizes parliamentary sovereignty, shaping how power is exercised and challenged in each system. The rational approach can be used to account for these similarities as political actors in both countries act strategically to protect their interests within constitutional limits. The rational approach can be used to account for these differences as individuals adapt their behavior to maximize influence either through entrenched constitutional rules in the US or through parliamentary processes in the UK. The cultural approach can be used to account for these similarities as both political systems are shaped by shared democratic values and respect for individual rights. The cultural approach can be used to account for these differences as US political culture strongly values constitutionalism and limited government while UK political culture accepts parliamentary sovereignty and pragmatic change. The structural approach can be used to account for these similarities as both constitutions establish core institutions such as legislatures, executives, and courts that structure political outcomes. The structural approach can be used to account for these differences as the codified separation of powers in the US creates stronger institutional checks, whereas the UK system allows greater flexibility through its uncodified structure. In terms of powers, strengths, and weaknesses of each of the houses, the UK Parliament consists of the House of Commons, which is powerful due to its democratic mandate, and the House of Lords, which provides expertise and scrutiny but lacks democratic legitimacy, while the US Congress consists of the House of Representatives and the Senate, both of which have significant legislative powers, resulting in stronger checks but slower law-making in the US. In terms of the extent to which each of the houses are equal, the UK houses are unequal as the House of Commons can ultimately override the House of Lords, whereas the US houses are largely equal as both the House of Representatives and the Senate must agree to legislation. The rational approach can be used to account for these similarities as legislators in both systems act strategically to advance policy goals and political careers within institutional constraints. The rational approach can be used to account for these differences as political actors adjust their behavior to maximize influence either through a dominant lower house in the UK or through bargaining between equal chambers in the US. The cultural approach can be used to account for these similarities as both systems value representative democracy and legislative scrutiny. The cultural approach can be used to account for these differences as UK political culture accepts unelected expertise in the House of Lords while US political culture emphasizes electoral legitimacy for both houses. The structural approach can be used to account for these similarities as both legislative branches are bicameral and perform lawmaking and scrutiny functions. The structural approach can be used to account for these differences as the UK system structurally favours the House of Commons whereas the US system constitutionally enshrines near equality between the two houses. In terms of the basis for and relative extent of their powers, the US Supreme Court derives strong authority from a codified constitution and judicial review allowing it to strike down legislation, while the UK Supreme Court derives its powers from statute and common law and cannot overturn acts of Parliament, resulting in greater judicial influence over politics in the US. In terms of the relative independence of the Supreme Court in the US and UK, the US Supreme Court enjoys greater independence due to life tenure and constitutional protection, while the UK Supreme Court is more constrained by parliamentary sovereignty, affecting how far judges can challenge government action. In terms of the effectiveness of the protection of rights in each country, the US provides strong constitutional protection through the Bill of Rights enforced by the Supreme Court, whereas the UK relies on the Human Rights Act and parliamentary processes, leading to stronger legal safeguards in the US but greater political flexibility in the UK. In terms of the effectiveness of interest groups in the protection of civil rights in the USA and the UK, US interest groups are often more influential due to litigation and constitutional rights-based challenges, while UK groups tend to focus on lobbying and political pressure, shaping different methods of rights protection. The rational approach can be used to account for these similarities as judges and interest groups in both systems act strategically to maximize influence and protect rights within legal constraints. The rational approach can be used to account for these differences as actors respond to stronger constitutional powers and judicial review in the US and more limited judicial authority in the UK. The cultural approach can be used to account for these similarities as both countries share liberal democratic values that support civil liberties and the rule of law. The cultural approach can be used to account for these differences as US political culture places greater faith in courts as protectors of rights while UK political culture traditionally trusts Parliament to safeguard liberties. The structural approach can be used to account for these similarities as both systems include supreme courts that interpret law and influence the protection of rights. The structural approach can be used to account for these differences as the US constitutional structure entrenches judicial review and strong court powers while the UK structure subordinates the courts to parliamentary sovereignty. In terms of the basis for and relative extent of their powers, the US Supreme Court derives strong authority from a codified constitution and judicial review allowing it to strike down legislation, while the UK Supreme Court derives its powers from statute and common law and cannot overturn acts of Parliament, resulting in greater judicial influence over politics in the US. In terms of the relative independence of the Supreme Court in the US and UK, the US Supreme Court enjoys greater independence due to life tenure and constitutional protection, while the UK Supreme Court is more constrained by parliamentary sovereignty, affecting how far judges can challenge government action. In terms of the effectiveness of the protection of rights in each country, the US provides strong constitutional protection through the Bill of Rights enforced by the Supreme Court, whereas the UK relies on the Human Rights Act and parliamentary processes, leading to stronger legal safeguards in the US but greater political flexibility in the UK. In terms of the effectiveness of interest groups in the protection of civil rights in the USA and the UK, US interest groups are often more influential due to litigation and constitutional rights-based challenges, while UK groups tend to focus on lobbying and political pressure, shaping different methods of rights protection. The rational approach can be used to account for these similarities as judges and interest groups in both systems act strategically to maximize influence and protect rights within legal constraints. The rational approach can be used to account for these differences as actors respond to stronger constitutional powers and judicial review in the US and more limited judicial authority in the UK. The cultural approach can be used to account for these similarities as both countries share liberal democratic values that support civil liberties and the rule of law. The cultural approach can be used to account for these differences as US political culture places greater faith in courts as protectors of rights while UK political culture traditionally trusts Parliament to safeguard liberties. The structural approach can be used to account for these similarities as both systems include supreme courts that interpret law and influence the protection of rights. The structural approach can be used to account for these differences as the US constitutional structure entrenches judicial review and strong court powers while the UK structure subordinates the courts to parliamentary sovereignty. In terms of the nature of party systems, the UK operates a multi-party system while the US has a two-party system, affecting voter choice and the balance between representation and stability in politics and government. In terms of internal unity, UK political parties tend to display stronger party discipline than US parties, leading to more cohesive policymaking in the UK and greater individual autonomy among US politicians. In terms of policy profiles, the main parties in both countries broadly compete for the centre ground but differ in emphasis, with UK parties focusing more on welfare and public services and US parties prioritising taxation, federal power, and social issues. In terms of campaign finance and party funding, both systems face debates about the influence of money in politics, though these concerns are more pronounced in the US where private donations play a larger role than in the UK. In terms of pressure groups, both the UK and US feature active and influential groups, but US pressure groups often have greater resources and rely more heavily on lobbying and litigation, shaping policy more directly than in the UK. The rational approach can be used to account for these similarities as political actors in both systems act strategically to maximize votes, funding, and influence. The rational approach can be used to account for these differences as parties and individuals respond to different incentives created by electoral competition, funding rules, and institutional opportunities. The cultural approach can be used to account for these similarities as both political systems are underpinned by democratic values and expectations of political participation. The cultural approach can be used to account for these differences as US political culture emphasizes individualism and free political expression while UK political culture values collective action and party loyalty. The structural approach can be used to account for these similarities as both systems provide formal channels for party competition, elections, and group participation. The structural approach can be used to account for these differences as electoral systems, party funding rules, and institutional access create distinct patterns of party behavior and pressure group influence in the UK and US. Thank you for watching this video on the government and politics of the USA. I'll see you in the next one.